sure some of you got some questions for Tom. I sincerely hope so. I mean, what I just like to make an observation first. And obviously, Tom's dealt with two particular periods, right? Which mean have a continuity, yet to a certain extent. I think one of the things that's interesting about Michael X was he seemed to move from the. There's not many people who actually experienced the Ragman area of Notting Hill and the sort of countercultural aspect of it. I think, you've got people who might have one or the other experience.
That's what everybody says with Michael, that he moved between, and whether he was a force for good or...
And also there were, I mean, obviously, Absolute Beginners, the book we've talked about before, by Colin McInnes, actually ends with the Notting Hill race riots, which had quite an impact in this country. I mean, obviously for a lot of people they're just going back quite a time. But also to go back to what Tom was talking about, 68, I mean, there was I think it was 65, was it the Poetry Olympics? Was that? Poetry Olympics with this Albert Hall with Allen Ginsberg, which was a big countercultural, it was the first manifestation of it. And on a superficial level, it looks like they're almost two different worlds, you know, based in Notting Hill. But there is a continuity there. But I'm sure most of you have got more interesting observations to make on this than me. So whoever wants to ask a few questions, please feel free to go ahead. Yeah, Bill?
It's not so much a question as a comment, that probably outside Notting Hill, this building is probably one of the most appropriate places to have this kind of talk, because I mean, it has been mentioned that Tom thought that there was a meeting here at Houseman's. It probably wasn't actually in the shop, it was probably in the meeting room that was then downstairs. We'd opened this building in 1959, and the front of the basement downstairs was a meeting room available to all kinds of sympathetic organisations, and I'm pretty sure that it probably could be checked if I was given the date. I could probably find it out, not necessarily from my own records, because of course we were not only in this shop selling all the kind of literature that represented the counterculture. I mean, Oz and IT have been mentioned, but of course there was also Peace News, still published upstairs now, but a monthly, but then a weekly, and apart from reporting radical politics, it was also regularly reporting the counterculture, and certainly I remember the preschool and so forth being reported, so that meeting was probably advertised in Peace News, and that could be checked if I had some idea of the date. I mean, but as I say, I'm simply representing that this building itself, both the Houseman selling all the literature, which included not only as IT and Peace News, but a huge number of more ephemeral publications, pamphlets, and short-run magazines, many of them cyclo-styled, with only a small circulation, costing a penny or two, real pennies of course in those days. And this shop would be one of the few places, apart from the street corners in Notting Hill and other sort of places, that one could actually buy it, because of course the regular wholesalers and distributors wouldn't touch them with a barge pole. And this is one of the things that this shop was known for then, and is still known for now. So I simply sort of make those few observations of linking, as it were, the counterculture of the 50s and 60s with the counterculture of today, which we still represent.
But that it would have been either really early 66 or in 65. I think it's London Free School, that it wasn't necessarily meant to be Notting Hill originally.
It was in the air, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, the point about
so I think 65, kind of after the Albert Hall Beat Poets Olympics.
I think that was. I mean, I think people don't appreciate that. Whatever they call it, the Poetry Olympics. That, I mean, as people reminisce about it, the idea of I think people like Jeff Nuttall, Trocky, and all.
We haven't mentioned Trocky, of course.
People who Tom mentioned, like involved in the Free School, Jeff Nuttall, but also Trocky as well. They built the idea actually of booking the Albert Hall to Poetry Olympics. On one level, seems a crazy idea, but it actually just filled up. I mean, unfortunately, we haven't got the book, but because it's out of stock at the publishers. But another book that's quite interesting is the McFarren book, Give the Anarchist a Cigarette.
Is that out of print already?
No, it's out of stock at the publishers. But he reminisces, Mick Fallon of the Deviants, who reminisces a lot about this sort of thing and talks about, I think Tom talked about the Roundhouse, where Michael X was the, well, you know, they were the security, weren't they, and all that sort of thing. I mean, basically, and it's a very interesting period because there's an interesting connection between the sort of Notting Hill riots and the Windrush generation who came over, who created that sort of more free and easy atmosphere, and then the sort of almost more bohemian and political radicals who in the 60s moved down to that. I mean, I think it's quite interesting that places like King Mob were based around that area, and as you say, all the graffiti that came out in that. There's a sort of connection between the two movements, but sometimes it's quite difficult to see what the connection is, but there's a sort of...
All these connected, I think I just sort of mentioned him in a list, John Michel,
yeah,
who's just died. He was a key figure. He was, yeah, I think he was the first, or him or Trocky, these bohemian beatnik proto-hippie guys that Michael de Freitas was getting in with. And
we're in Notting Hill.
Yeah, and not, I think he wasn't really hustling. Well, yeah, it was all hustling, but they by all, and Mick Farron as well speaks highly of Michael.
We've got anybody else from the audience before Tom and me just have one of our typical pub conversations. So go on, yeah.
I was only going to say I think there were three sort of rather different elements at work, and there was very little mixing between the counterculture and the local working class, and the people who had come in with a political motive, the People's Association, which I was a member, and they didn't mix. It was a great tragedy that the whole thing couldn't have come together to try and get the local authority, which was Kensington and Chelsea, one of the most backward local authorities at that time in the country, probably in the world. They were totally and completely indifferent to the welfare of the working class population. And while all these things were going on in the counterculture, one mustn't forget that they still have this absolutely fundamental problem of massive overcrowding when the housing conditions were totally appalling. I mean, when we did the housing survey in '67, in fact, you know, I got all the statistics if you're ever interested in having them, but there were people living in literally a married couple with 4 children in one bloody room. And this was, but the counterculture was great respect for them, because I knew Heathcote Williams and one or two other people you mentioned, but they were not actually concerned with the improvement of the local working class.
It didn't really connect with
their lives, which was wonderful, and the revolutionary press and so on was excellent and so on, but it was nothing to do with the working people of North Kensington at that time.
What about with the People's Association, George Clark?
George Clark was actually a quite different person to the People's Association. They didn't like each other at all. George Clark was a self-seeker, and he attached himself entirely to the white working class, cross sort of tempered group around the Goldhorn pub,
the anti-carnival group.
He had no footing at all with the black community. The People's Association didn't either. And the Labour Party, I mean, there were no black members of the Labour Party, which is incredible.
But I think the locals...
So you've got all these groups working separately. And internationally, you've got the 68 Paris and so on, you've got the universities happening in America and so on. So, but equally, most people are trying desperately to just stay alive and make a living.